The wind in Mercy Ridge did not just blow, it hunted. It came down from the jagged spine of the northern foothills with a voice like tearing canvas, stripping the soil from the plains and the heat from a man's bones. In the late autumn of 1878, the town sat huddled against the vast emptiness of the Wyoming Territory like a small, stubborn scab on the land. It was a place where silence was heavy and the horizon felt like a threat. Jonah Hale rode the northern perimeter of his land, his collar turned up against the biting air. The sky was the color of bruised iron, sitting low and heavy over the sagebrush. Jonah was 32 years old, though the sun and the wind had carved deeper lines around his eyes, making him look older. He had the kind of face that did not give much away, broad and weathered, with eyes the color of dry river stones. Since his wife, Martha, had passed from the fever 3 years ago, Jonah had become a man of few words and even fewer complaints. He worked his cattle, paid his debts on time, and kept his grief locked behind the heavy oak door of his empty ranch house. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Rusty, snorted and danced sideways as a tumbleweed skittered across the frost-hardened ground. Jonah steadied the animal with a firm hand and a low murmur. He was checking the fence line, a never-ending task of mending wire and replacing rotted posts. The cattle were already drifting toward the lower pastures. Sensing the change in the air, the old-timers in town had been muttering about a hard winter, the kind that froze cattle standing up, and Jonah respected the instincts of men who had survived out here longer than he had. He finished splicing a broken wire and looked toward the town in the distance. Mercy Ridge was a collection of rough-hewn timber buildings and false fronts strung along a single muddy thoroughfare. There was a general store, a livery, 2 saloons that did brisk business, and, dominating the center of town, the Church of Sacred Grace. The church was the only building with a coat of white paint, standing stark and bright against the gray, brown landscape. It was the heart of the community, or at least, that was what Father Matthias Crow insisted. Jonah turned his horse toward town. He needed supplies before the weather turned, and he had promised to deliver a side of beef to the mercantile. As he rode, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and pine pitch. Life in Mercy Ridge was a precarious balance. The water was scarce, the soil was thin, and the peace was fragile. Settlers looked sideways at the drifters who passed through on their way to the goldfields in the Black Hills. Everyone looked with unease at the smoke rising from the foothills where the Arapaho and Shoshone bands still moved, trying to hold on to a shrinking world. Fear was a currency here, traded as freely as silver dollars, and lately, the exchange rate was high. When Jonah arrived on the main street, the mood was tense. Men stood in knots on the boardwalks, their hands tucked into their coats, speaking in hushed tones. Jonah tied Rusty to the rail outside the mercantile and stepped onto the wood planks. The sound of his boots was heavy and rhythmic. He nodded to Thomas Miller, the store owner, who was sweeping dust out the front door. "Afternoon." "Thomas," Jonah said. Miller stopped sweeping and leaned on the broom. His face was pale, his eyes darting toward the church down the street. "Jonah," Miller said. "You haven't heard, then—" "Heard what?" Jonah asked. "Little Mary Sutcliffe," Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She is gone." Jonah felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Mary was one of the orphans taken in by the church charity, a quiet girl of 10 with hair the color of straw. She was often seen scrubbing the steps or carrying water for the priest's garden. "Gone how?" Jonah asked. "Run off." Miller shook his head. "Taken, vanished. She was seen near the woodpile behind the rectory just before dusk yesterday. Father Crow says he heard a cry, but when he looked, there was nothing but shadows. He says there are signs." "What kind of signs?" Jonah asked. Miller looked down at his boots. Dark signs, unnatural ones. Jonah frowned. He was a practical man. He believed in what he could see: broken fences, sick calves, the balance of a ledger. Talk of unnatural things usually meant someone was trying to hide a very natural, very human mistake. "I will help look," Jonah said. "I can spare 2 days before the herd needs moving." The town meeting was held that evening in the church. The sanctuary was packed, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, kerosene, and fear. Father Matthias Crow stood at the pulpit, a tall man with a mane of silver hair and eyes that seemed to burn with a feverish intensity. He was charismatic, possessing a voice that could soothe a weeping widow or lash a sinner like a whip. He held the town in his palm, mediating land disputes and blessing marriages, his approval essential for anyone wishing to do business in Mercy Ridge. "My children," Father Crow boomed, his voice resonating off the timber rafters. "We are tested. The wilderness is not merely rocks and trees. It is a domain of ancient shadows. Little Mary has not just wandered off. No child wanders into the night without cause. She was lured." A murmur rippled through the pews. Jonah stood near the back, his hat in his hands. He watched the priest closely. Crow's movements were theatrical, his hands grasping the edge of the pulpit until his knuckles turned white. "The devil walks in many forms," Crow continued, his voice dropping to a hiss that carried to the last row. "He walks in the guise of the heathen, in the guise of the stranger. We have allowed our vigilance to slip. We have tolerated impurities in our midst. And now, the wolf has taken a lamb." Jonah shifted his weight. He did not like this. The priest was stoking a fire that could easily burn down the wrong house. He looked around the room and saw the fear in the eyes of his neighbors. They wanted an answer, and Crow was giving them a target, even if it was vague. When the service ended, the men gathered outside to organize a search party. The sheriff, a weary man named Bill Hatcher, who owed his position largely to the priest's endorsement, was handing out lanterns. Jonah approached him. "Bill, where are we starting?" Jonah asked. Hatcher spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Father Crow thinks we should check the creek beds to the west. Says he had a vision of running water." "And what about the road east?" Jonah asked. "A wagon passed through yesterday. Maybe she was taken by someone passing by." Hatcher narrowed his eyes. "You questioning the father?" "Jonah, I am questioning the logic." Jonah said calmly, "Visions do not leave tracks. Wagons do." Hatcher grunted. "You go east then. Hail. The rest of us will follow the father's lead." As the men dispersed, Jonah saw a figure standing in the shadows of the alley between the livery and the bakery. It was a woman, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, watching the commotion with a stillness that set her apart from the frantic townsfolk. It was Eliza Gray. Eliza lived 2 miles out of town, in a small cabin near the bend of the White River. Her father had been a trapper, a Frenchman, and her mother a woman of the Shoshone people. Eliza had the dark eyes and high cheekbones of her mother's kin, but her standing in Mercy Ridge was defined by her profession as much as her blood. She was a healer and a midwife. The women of the town called for her when the pains of childbirth began or when a fever would not break, whispering for her help in the dead of night. But in the daylight, on the street, they crossed to the other side to avoid her shadow. She was necessary, but she was not welcome. Jonah had never spoken more than 10 words to her, but he had seen her work once, calming a horse that had tangled itself in wire when 3 grown men could not get near it. He nodded to her now, a small gesture of acknowledgement. She did not nod back. Her gaze was fixed on the church door, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and vanished into the darkness. The search began in earnest the next morning, but the weather had other plans. The sky, which had been threatening for days, finally broke open. It did not snow gently. The wind drove the flakes horizontally, stinging the eyes and blotting out the world in a swirling white curtain. Jonah was 5 miles east of town, riding along a ridgeline. When the blizzard hit with full force, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of an hour. The familiar landmarks, the twisted juniper tree, the rock formation that looked like a bear, were erased. He pulled his scarf up over his nose. "We have to go back. Rusty!" he shouted over the roar of the wind. But the horse was spooked. The scent of ozone and the howling wind had the animal rolling its eyes. As Jonah tried to turn him, a crack of thunder, rare and terrifying in a snowstorm, shook the ground. Rusty reared, his back hooves slipping on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. Jonah was thrown. He hit the ground hard. The air driven from his lungs. He felt a snap in his right leg, followed by a searing heat that sickeningly contrasted with the freezing cold. He tumbled down the steep embankment, crashing through brush and snow until he slammed into a boulder at the bottom of the ravine. Darkness swirled at the edges of his vision. He lay there for a moment, gasping, waiting for the pain to subside, but it only sharpened into a throbbing agony. He tried to stand, but his right leg collapsed under him. He looked down. His trousers were torn, and blood was soaking into the gray wool, bright and alarming against the snow. A jagged branch, buried in the drift, had gouged a deep furrow in his thigh, and the fall had twisted his knee badly. "Rusty," he called out, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. The horse was gone. Jonah knew he was in trouble. A man could freeze to death in 2 hours in a storm like this. He had to move. He dragged himself upright, using a dead sapling as a crutch. He tried to get his bearings. The wind was coming from the north. If he kept the wind on his left shoulder, he might reach the river road. He walked for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. The cold was beginning to make his thoughts sluggish. His leg dragged behind him, a dead weight of fire and ice. He fell twice, each time finding it harder to get up. Then, through the white haze, he saw a dim orange glow. It was faint, flickering like a ghost, but it was steady. He pushed toward it, his will to survive overriding the screaming protest of his body. The shape of a cabin emerged from the whiteness. Smoke whipped from the chimney. Jonah stumbled against the door and pounded on the wood with his frozen fist. "Help!" he croaked. The door opened. Warmth and light spilled out, blinding him. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the firelight. "Jonah Hale," a woman's voice said, sharp with surprise. He tried to speak, but his knees gave way, and he pitched forward into the room. He woke to the smell of sage and boiling water. He was lying on a narrow cot covered in buffalo robes. The cabin was small but meticulously ordered. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters. Mint, yarrow, willow bark. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He tried to sit up and hissed in pain. "Lie still," the voice said. Eliza Gray was standing over him. She held a basin of steaming water and a clean cloth. Her hair, usually hidden under a bonnet when she came to town, hung in a loose, dark braid over her shoulder. Her face was serious, her eyes dark and assessing. "You have lost a lot of blood. Mr. Hale," she said, "and the cold nearly took your toes." Jonah looked down. His leg was bandaged with clean white linen. He was stripped to his shirt and undergarments, covered by the heavy furs. "How long?" Jonah asked, his voice raspy. "You have been here 4 hours," Eliza said. "The storm is worse. You cannot leave tonight." Jonah sank back onto the pillow. "The town will talk," he muttered. "If they know I am here, let them talk," Eliza said, dipping the cloth into the water. "Talk keeps them warm. It does not stop the bleeding." She pulled back the furs to check the bandage. Jonah flinched, not from pain, but from the sudden intimacy. He was a private man, used to handling his own hurts, to be laid bare, dependent on the hands of a woman the town whispered was a witch, unsettled him. But her hands were gentle. There was no hesitation in her touch, only a practiced, confident skill. She checked the stitching she had done on the gash in his thigh. "I had to sew it," she said calmly. "It was deep. You were lucky it missed the artery." "Thank you," Jonah said. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the fatigue etched around her mouth, the guardedness in her posture. He saw a woman who lived under siege, yet she had opened her door to him without question. "Why?" he asked. "Why what?" Eliza asked, wringing out the cloth. "Why help me? You know what the men in town say about you. You know I am one of them." Eliza paused. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unblinking. "You are one of them, Jonah Hale. But you are not like them. I have seen you. You pay fair prices for your supplies. You tip your hat to the laundress, and you look at people. Not through them." She turned away to the fire, stirring a pot that hung over the flames. Besides, she added softly, I would not leave a dog to die in this weather. She brought him a mug of bitter, hot broth. Drink. It will help with the fever. Jonah drank. It tasted of earth and roots. Strange, but strengthening. As the warmth spread through his chest, the guardedness he had worn like armor for 3 years began to crack. Just a hairline fracture. You live out here alone, he said. It is not safe. Safety is a myth, Eliza replied, sitting in a rocking chair near the fire. In town, I am safe from the wolves, but not the neighbors. Out here, I know what the dangers are. I can see them coming. There was a silence between them, but it was not the heavy, awkward silence of strangers. It was the quiet of two people waiting out a storm. The wind howled outside, battering the cabin walls. But inside, the fire popped and hissed. Jonah watched her profile as she stared into the flames. She was beautiful, he realized with a start, not in the delicate, fainting way the magazines from the East admired, but in a fierce, enduring way, like the land itself. Tell me about the girl, Eliza said suddenly. Mary. Jonah sighed. She is gone, vanished near the church. Crow says it is the devil. Eliza's expression hardened. Matthias Crow sees the devil in everything he cannot control. You do not like him, Jonah observed. I know him, Eliza corrected. There is a difference. She stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the white abyss. They will blame me, you know, if she is not found, or if she is found dead. They do not know anything yet, Jonah said. They do not need to know, Eliza said, turning back to him. Her eyes were fierce. They need to fear. And when they fear, they need to hate. I am the easiest thing to hate. I am the woman with the strange herbs, the woman with the wrong blood. Jonah struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain. I will not let them, he said. I will tell them you saved me. Eliza looked at him, and for a moment, the mask slipped. He saw a flash of profound loneliness, a hunger for connection that matched his own buried grief. Your word is good. Jonah, she said softly, using his given name, but against the word of God's chosen man, it is a pebble against a flood. Their eyes locked, in the small, firelit room. The air seemed to thin. Jonah felt a pull toward her that terrified him more than the blizzard. It was a dangerous thing, this spark. It was a spark that could burn down a life. But he did not look away, and neither did she. The storm raged for another 24 hours. For 2 days and a night, they existed in a suspended world. Eliza tended his wound, fed him, and kept the fire fed. They spoke of small things, the price of cattle, the best way to dry venison, the way the light hit the canyon walls in summer. They avoided the past and the future, living only in the present safety of the cabin. When the wind finally died and the sun broke through, the world was blindingly white. The drifts were 6 feet high against the north wall. I have to go, Jonah said. He was leaning heavily on a crutch Eliza had fashioned from a curing stick. I know, Eliza said. She stood by the door, her hands clasped in front of her. He hesitated. Eliza, go, she said, her voice tight. Before they come looking. Jonah stepped out into the cold. The air was crisp and still. He managed to hobble toward the road, where the snow was blown thinner. He had not gone a mile when he saw them. A group of riders was cutting through the snow, heading toward Eliza's cabin. It was the sheriff, Bill Hatcher, accompanied by 3 of the town's roughest men and, riding at the front, Father Crow. They spotted Jonah and spurred their horses. Jonah, Hatcher shouted, reining in his horse. We thought you were dead. We found your horse at the creek. I sought shelter, Jonah said, leaning on his crutch, trying to keep his weight off the bad leg. Shelter where? Crow asked. The priest's eyes were sharp, darting toward the cabin in the distance. At the healer's cabin, Jonah said firmly. She patched me up. A murmur went through the men. Crow's face darkened. You stayed with the woman, Crow said, his voice dripping with distaste. I would have frozen, Jonah said. We were coming to see her anyway, Hatcher said grimly. Why? Jonah asked, moving to block their path, though he was in no condition to stop 4 men on horses. Because of this, Hatcher said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle of red wool. It was a shawl, small, knitted with a distinct pattern. "We found it snagged on a juniper bush not 200 yards from her property line," Hatcher said. "It belongs to Mary Sutcliffe." Jonah stared at the shawl. It was bright red against the white snow. It looked undisturbed. The snow around the bush had been wind-scoured, but the shawl was not buried. It was draped. "When did you find this?" Jonah asked. "Just now," Hatcher said. Jonah looked at the shawl, then at the priest. The storm had just ended. The wind had been blowing 70 miles an hour for 2 days. A shawl caught on a bush would have been shredded or buried under 5 feet of drift. It would not be sitting there like a flag. "It is too neat," Jonah said quietly. "What did you say?" Crow asked, leaning down from his black horse. "I said it is too neat," Jonah said. Louder this time. "That wind would have carried a shawl to Kansas. How is it sitting right here on her doorstep? Are you defending her?" "Jonah," Crow asked softly, "after spending 2 nights in her bed?" The accusation hung in the cold air like a blade. The other men looked at Jonah with sudden suspicion. The respect he had earned over 5 years of honest labor was evaporating in seconds. "I was injured," Jonah said, his voice like flint. "And I am saying that shawl was placed there, placed by the devil to mark his territory," Crow proclaimed, turning to the men, "or dropped by a witch dragging a child to her doom. We must question her. Now." Jonah planted his crutch in the snow. "You will not harm her." "Step aside." "Jonah," Hatcher said, his hand resting on his pistol. "You are hurt. You are not thinking straight. Maybe she gave you something to cloud your mind." Jonah looked at the men he had known for years. He saw the panic in their eyes, the eagerness to find a monster so they could stop being afraid of the dark. He looked at Crow and saw a cold, calculating satisfaction. "If you go in there," Jonah said, "you go in as lawmen, not a mob. I will be a witness to whatever happens." Crow smiled, a thin, mirthless curving of his lips. "Witness all you like, Mr. Hale. The truth reveals itself to the righteous." Jonah turned and began to limp back toward the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had survived the storm, but the real danger was just arriving. He could feel the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on him, but as he thought of Eliza's steady hands and the quiet pride in her eyes, he knew he would not back down. He had checked the priest's story, and he had frozen, not from the cold, but from the sudden, chilling realization that the devil they were hunting was not in the woods. He was riding a black horse, wearing a collar, and pointing a finger at the only innocent soul for miles. Jonah gritted his teeth against the pain in his leg and moved faster. Part 1 of the nightmare had ended with the blizzard. Part 2 was beginning now. The air inside Eliza Gray's cabin was thick with the musk of wet wool and the sharp, metallic tang of intrusion. 5 men stood in the small main room, their boots muddying the floorboards that Eliza kept scrubbed to a pale yellow. Sheriff Bill Hatcher looked uncomfortable, his hat in his hands. But Father Matthias Crow stood near the hearth, his black coat absorbing the light, his eyes scanning the dried herbs hanging from the rafters as if they were evidence of a capital crime. Jonah Hale leaned heavily on his makeshift crutch in the doorway, his injured leg throbbing with a dull, sickening rhythm. He had forced himself to accompany them, ignoring the pain, because he knew that, without a witness, this search would turn into a sacking. "Search everything," Crow commanded, his voice smooth and cold. "The devil hides in small places." The men began to turn over baskets and open trunks. They handled Eliza's meager possessions, a quilt sewn from scraps, a wooden box of seeds, a few medical texts, with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Eliza stood by the window, her arms crossed over her chest. She did not weep, and she did not beg. Her face was a mask of stone, but Jonah saw the tremor in her hands where she gripped her own elbows. "There is nothing here," Jonah said, his voice cutting through the noise of rummaging. "You are tearing apart a woman's home for a shawl you already found outside. We look for the tools of her trade. Crow said without turning. Charms, fetishes, the things that whisper to the darkness. One of the deputies, a young man named Silas, who had once come to Eliza for a toothache, kicked open a small cupboard. A jar of salve rolled out and shattered on the floor. Careful, Jonah snapped, taking a step forward. Eliza did not move. Let them look. Jonah, let them see there is nothing but roots and hard work. Hatcher crouched near the back door, the one that led to the creek. He frowned, running a finger along the doorframe. Hold on, Hatcher said. Crow turned sharply. What is it? William? Hatcher pointed to the wood around the latch. It was splintered, the fresh white of the timber exposed against the aged gray. Someone forced this door, he said. Recently, the wood is still dry. Crow's eyes narrowed. A lover, perhaps, or a familiar spirit forcing its way in, or someone breaking in to plant evidence. Jonah said, his voice low and dangerous. He hobbled over to look. The damage was clear. The door had been jimmied open from the outside with a pry bar or a heavy knife. There were muddy prints on the floorboards just inside the threshold. Large prints, made by a heavy boot with a distinct hobnail pattern. They were not Eliza's moccasins, and they were too wide for Jonah's boots. Someone was here before us, Jonah said, looking at the sheriff. Before the storm settled. Look at the mud. It is dried into the cracks. Hatcher looked uneasy. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. It looks like a break-in. Father. Crow waved a dismissive hand. A distraction. The devil's hand works through many vessels. Perhaps she invited the darkness in, and it left its mark. But we have found no girl here, not yet. He turned his gaze to Eliza. The shawl is enough to raise questions. Miss Gray, the town is frightened. Frightened people demand answers. I suggest you pray for the girl's safe return. For your sake. The priest swept out of the cabin, his coat billowing like smoke. The deputies followed, looking sheepish as they stepped over the broken jar. Hatcher paused at the door, glancing at Jonah. You best get that leg looked at properly. Jonah, the sheriff muttered. And you best decide which side of the fence you are on. When the sound of the horses faded, the silence that rushed back into the cabin was deafening. Jonah let out a breath he felt he had been holding for an hour. He sagged against the table, the adrenaline fading to leave only exhaustion. Eliza moved then. She went to the cupboard, picked up a broom, and began to sweep the shards of glass. Her movements were jerky, fueled by a suppressed rage. Leave it, Jonah said gently. I will not, she said, not looking at him. I will not live in their mess. Jonah limped to a chair and sat down. They are going to come back. Eliza, Crow is not done. He has a narrative now. The outsider, the impure blood. He is building a fire, and he intends to put you in the center of it. Eliza stopped sweeping. She stood with her back to him, her shoulders rigid. I know what he is doing, she said, her voice tight. Do you think this is the first time I have been blamed for the rain, or the drought, or a calf born with two heads? I am the convenient answer to every difficult question in Mercy Ridge. This is different, Jonah said. A child is missing. People are not just superstitious, they are grieving and terrified. You need to leave. Go to the fort. Go to Cheyenne. Run away. She turned then, her eyes blazing. Admit guilt by flight. I have done nothing. Jonah, this is my home. My mother is buried on that hill. I have survived blizzards, smallpox, and loneliness that would kill a man like Matthias Crow in a week. I will not be driven out by a liar in a collar. Jonah looked at her, and the admiration he felt was a physical weight in his chest. She was proud, dangerously so. Then we have to fight him, Jonah said, but not with shouting. We need proof. Eliza leaned the broom against the wall. What proof? The man speaks for God. Who argues with God? We argue with the man, Jonah said. That shawl was planted. The door was forced. Someone wants the town looking at you so they do not look somewhere else. Eliza studied him, the anger in her face softening into something more complex, wariness mixed with a fragile hope. Why do you care so much? She asked quietly. You are a rancher. You have land to lose. Reputation. Jonah looked down at his hands. They were rough, scarred from barbed wire and rope. I lost my wife to a fever I could not stop, he said, his voice rough. I watched her burn up while I sat there. Useless. I promised myself I would never stand by and watch something wrong happen again if I could stop it. Decency has to matter. Eliza, even out here, especially out here. Eliza walked over to the table and sat opposite him. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Her skin was cool, her fingers strong. Then we investigate, she said, but we do it quietly. If they see us together, they will say you are bewitched. I have been called worse, Jonah said, though the touch of her hand sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with witchcraft. The next few days were a study in tension. The snow began to melt, turning the roads into rivers of slush. But the mood in Mercy Ridge remained frozen. Jonah returned to his ranch, but his mind was in the town. He used the excuse of business, selling a string of horses, to spend his days in Mercy Ridge. He started with the money. Jonah knew that men like Crow often valued power, but power required gold to maintain. He went to the church vestry on a Tuesday morning, claiming he wanted to review the tithe records for his ranch to ensure he was square for the year. The church clerk, a nervous, bird-like man named Silas Vane, hesitated but allowed him access to the heavy, leather-bound ledger. Jonah sat in the corner of the office, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was precise, columns of figures marching down the paper. He found his own contributions, marked clearly. But as he turned back to the previous years, he noticed irregularities. There were pages that had been carefully excised, cut close to the binding with a razor. The dates corresponded to the arrival of large donations from wealthy families in the East, endowments meant for the orphanage and the hospital wing that never seemed to get built. He traced the jagged edge of a missing page with his thumb. There were also entries for supplies that made no sense. Large quantities of lye, heavy chain, and repeated payments to a doctor, T.S. in Denver for medicinal sedatives. Jonah closed the book as Father Crow entered the room. The priest brought a chill with him, smelling of incense and damp earth. "Mr. Hale," Crow said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Checking your standing with the Almighty? Just checking my arithmetic." "Father," Jonah said, standing up. He kept his face impassive. "Times are lean. A man likes to know where his coin goes. Charity is a mystery, Jonah, not a transaction," Crow said smoothly. "It goes where the Lord wills it." Jonah nodded, donning his hat. Indeed. That evening, he met Eliza at the edge of the cottonwood grove, a mile out of town. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. "There are pages missing from the ledger," Jonah told her, keeping his voice low, "and he is buying sedatives." "Enough to put a horse to sleep for a week." Eliza shivered, pulling her cloak tighter. "Sedatives. And lie," Jonah added. Eliza looked away, toward the dark outline of the foothills. She was silent for a long time. "I was 14 when I went to the church," she said suddenly. Her voice was distant. "After my mother died, the town council said I could not live alone. They put me in the rectory attic. I scrubbed floors. I washed the linens." Jonah waited, sensing she was handing him a piece of herself she rarely showed. Crow was younger then, but he was the same. Eliza continued. "He liked to punish. He called it correction. There was a boy, a mute boy named Thomas. He broke a vase once. Crow locked him in the cellar for 3 days without light. When Thomas came out, he was not the same. He never looked anyone in the eye again." She turned to Jonah, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I left the night I saw Crow beating a girl because she smiled at a stable hand. He said he was beating the sin out of her. I realized then that his holiness was just a mask for something cruel, a hunger to control. That is why I live apart. Jonah, I cannot breathe the same air as that man." Jonah reached out and took her by the shoulders. The grief in her voice resonated with the hollow place in his own chest where Martha used to be. "We will stop him," Jonah said firmly. "I promise you." but the darkness moved faster than they did. 2 days later, the second disappearance happened. It was Sarah Miller, the 15-year-old daughter of the store owner. She had been delivering a basket of bread to the rectory kitchen. She never came home. This time, the panic in Mercy Ridge was immediate and violent. Thomas Miller ran through the streets screaming his daughter's name. The saloon emptied out. Men grabbed rifles and lanterns. The fear was no longer a simmer. It was a boil. Jonah was at the livery when the news broke. He saw the mob forming, their faces twisted with a terrifying righteousness. They were not looking for tracks this time. They were looking for a scapegoat. He rode hard for Eliza's cabin, terrified he would be too late. But she was not there. She was out on the ridge, gathering winter roots. He found her and brought her to a line shack on the far western edge of his property, a place so remote even the cattle rarely graze there. "Stay here," he told her. "Do not light a fire during the day." "Where are you going?" she asked, clutching his arm. "I have to find Sarah," Jonah said. "If I find her, I clear your name." He rode back toward the town, but he skirted the main streets. He went to the church. The search parties were out in the fields, leaving the building eerily quiet. Jonah circled around the back, to the area behind the rectory where the delivery wagons unloaded. The ground was frozen hard, but in the shadow of the storage shed, where the sun never hit, there was still mud. Jonah dismounted and knelt. He saw wagon ruts, fresh ones, deep ones, suggesting a heavy load. They did not lead away from town. They led directly up to the double doors of a stone outbuilding that sat against the hillside. Crow had always claimed the building was a consecrated storehouse for holy relics and sacramental wine, forbidden to the laity. Jonah approached the doors. They were locked with a heavy iron padlock. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. Then a faint, rhythmic scratching, like a mouse or a fingernail on stone. He stepped back, his heart hammering. He could not break the lock now. The noise would alert the housekeeper. He needed to get Eliza and come back with tools. He rode back to the line shack as the sky turned the color of a bruise. Another winter storm was rolling in, the weather in the high country shifting with lethal speed. By the time he reached the shack, the snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets. He burst through the door, shaking the snow from his coat. Eliza was sitting in the corner, wrapped in a blanket. "You are back," she breathed. "The storm is bad," Jonah said, barring the door. "We are stuck here for the night." The line shack was tiny, barely 10 feet square. It smelled of dry pine needles and old dust. There was a small pot-bellied stove in the corner, which Jonah quickly lit. The temperature outside was plummeting. He told her about the ruts and the sound in the shed. "It is a prison," Eliza whispered, horror in her eyes. "He is keeping them there." "Or worse," Jonah said grimly. "But we need to get inside. Tonight, we just survived the cold." The cold was a physical weight. The stove was too small to heat the whole shack against the blizzard. They huddled together near the iron warmth, wrapping themselves in the buffalo robes Jonah had kept stored there. The proximity was overwhelming. Jonah could smell the scent of sage in Eliza's hair, could feel the heat of her body pressing against his side, the fear of the day, the adrenaline of the chase, and the raw isolation of the storm stripped away the social barriers that usually stood between them. Eliza looked up at him. The firelight flickered on her face, highlighting the curve of her cheekbone and the depth of her dark eyes. "They will kill me if they find me." "Jonah," she said softly. "I can feel it. I will not let them." Jonah swore. He looked at her, and suddenly, the words were not enough. The need to comfort her, to affirm that they were alive in the face of so much death, broke through his restraint. He reached out and cupped her face in his rough hands. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "Jonah," she whispered. He kissed her. It was not a gentle, courtly kiss. It was desperate. It was the collision of two lonely, frightened people finding an anchor in the storm. It tasted of fear and longing. Jonah felt a hunger rise in him that he had thought dead and buried with Martha. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck. Eliza clung to him, her fingers digging into his coat. For a moment, the world outside, the priest, the mob, the missing girls, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of their bodies and the sound of the wind screaming against the logs. They broke apart, breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The air between them crackled with electricity. Jonah pulled back slightly, his hands still holding her arms. He looked into her eyes and saw the same startled desire he felt, but he also saw the reality of their situation. "If we do this," he said, his voice husky, "there is no going back, and tomorrow we might be fighting for our lives." Eliza nodded slowly. She reached up and touched his lips with her thumb. "We are already fighting," she said, "but you are right." "Not here, not like this." They pulled back, putting a few inches of respectful distance between them. Though their hands remained intertwined, they slept fitfully, sitting up, leaning against each other for warmth, the unspoken bond between them stronger than any vow. When the storm broke the next morning, the world was silent and white. They rode back toward Jonah's ranch, keeping to the tree line. But as they neared the main road, they saw a rider watching them from a ridge. It was Deputy Silas. He did not approach. He simply watched, then turned his horse and galloped back toward town. By noon, the whispers had started. Jonah Hale was not just protecting the witch, he was bedding her. He had taken her to his line shack. He was corrupted. The priest's words about impure blood and seduction took root in fertile soil. Jonah rode into town alone later that day to get supplies, leaving Eliza hidden at the ranch. The change in the atmosphere was palpable. Men who had known him for 10 years turned their backs. Women pulled their children close as he passed. He walked into the general store. Thomas Miller looked up from the counter, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Get out," Miller said, his voice shaking. "Thomas," Jonah said, reaching out a hand, "I am trying to find Sarah. Do not speak her name." Miller spat. "Father Crow told us you were with her, the Indian woman, while my daughter is missing. You were fornicating in the woods with the very evil that took her." "That is a lie," Jonah said, his voice rising. "Is it?" Miller challenged. "Were you with her last night?" Jonah hesitated. He could not deny it without lying, and he was a man who found lies difficult to swallow. "I was sheltering her from a mob." Jonah said, "You are bewitched." "Jonah," Miller said, turning his back, "you are no longer welcome here." Jonah walked out onto the street. He stood alone in the mud. The windows of the town felt like eyes, judging, hating. He realized then that the line had been drawn. He was on the other side now, with Eliza. He mounted his horse and looked toward the church. The white paint gleamed innocently in the sun, hiding the rot within. "You have them thinking I am the monster," Jonah thought, staring at the bell tower. "But you just made the mistake of cornering a man with nothing left to lose." He turned his horse and rode hard for the ranch. They needed tools. They needed weapons. And tonight, they were going to open those doors. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky when Jonah and Eliza slipped through the rear window of the church vestry. The town of Mercy Ridge slept the heavy, exhausted sleep of the frontier, but the silence felt brittle, as if the slightest noise would shatter the peace into violence. Jonah moved with a surprising grace for a big man, favoring his injured leg only slightly. He lifted Eliza over the sill, her moccasins touching the floorboards without a sound. The office smelled of beeswax, stale pipe tobacco, and the dry, papery scent of old authority. "Check the desk," Jonah whispered. "I will watch the door." Eliza moved to the heavy oak desk that dominated the room. It was here that Father Crow held court, dispensing judgments and collecting tithes. Her hands trembled as she pulled open the bottom drawer. It was locked, but the wood was old and dry. She used a thin metal shim she had brought from her medical kit, working the latch until it clicked softly. Inside, beneath a stack of blank sermons, was a leather folder tied with twine. "Jonah?" she hissed. He crossed the room, the shadow of his hat falling over the desk. Eliza untied the twine and spread the papers out in the moonlight filtering through the glass. They were not tithe records. They were receipts, scrawled in a heavy, jagged hand, from a supply house in Denver that dealt in mining equipment and bulk chemicals. Jonah squinted at the ink. "Item, 50 pounds of quicklime," he read, his voice dropping to a gravelly rumble. "Item, 10 yards of heavy-gauge iron chain. Item, 4 crates of laudanum. Extra potency." He looked at Eliza. The color had drained from her face, leaving her skin ash-gray in the dim light. "Lime burns flesh," she whispered. "It dissolves bone. Why would a priest need enough lime to bury a herd of cattle?" "And the chain," Jonah added, picking up another slip of paper. "Delivered to a Mr. Silas Vane, acting as agent. Vane is the clerk. He does whatever Crow tells him." Eliza picked up the receipt for the laudanum. "This is enough sedative to keep a grown man unconscious for a month. Or to keep—" She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth, "to keep a child quiet." Jonah finished for her. The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This was not the work of a sudden passion or a momentary lapse. This was a system, a cold, calculated infrastructure of procurement and concealment. Eliza slumped against the desk, the fight draining out of her legs. "I knew," she said, her voice cracking. "Deep down, I knew. When I was a girl in that house, I heard things, thumps in the night, cries that were cut off too quickly. But I told myself it was the wind. I told myself I was crazy because everyone said he was a saint." She looked up at Jonah, her eyes swimming with tears of fury and shame. "I ran away to save myself. Jonah, I left them behind. How many girls have vanished in 10 years because I was too of a coward to speak?" Jonah reached out and took her hands. They were cold as ice. "You were a child." "Eliza," he said firmly, "you were a child running from a wolf. Do not take his sin and make it your own." That is what he wants. He wants you to feel small so he can feel big. Eliza shook her head, a tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. "I should have burned this place down years ago." Jonah pulled her into him then, a rough, protective embrace. He held her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head, smelling the sage and wood smoke in her hair. "We are going to burn it down," he promised, his voice low and hard, "but not with fire. We are going to do it with the truth. Now grab those papers. We need proof that won't disappear when the sun comes up." They left the church as shadows, fading back into the night. But the weight of what they carried was heavier than any sack of grain. The next morning, the town of Mercy Ridge felt different. The air was sharper, the glances of the townsfolk more oblique. Jonah was at the livery stable, saddling a fresh horse, when Deputy Bill Hatcher walked in. Hatcher looked tired, his eyes baggy, chewing on a matchstick. He leaned against the stall door, watching Jonah tighten the cinch. "You are stirring up mud." "Jonah," Hatcher said quietly, "I am just riding my range." "Bill," Jonah said, not looking up. Hatcher spat the matchstick into the straw. "You know that is not what I mean." "I was at the saloon last night. Men are talking. They say you have lost your way. They say the Indian woman has clouded your mind with roots and whispers." Jonah turned then, his face like granite. "And what do you say?" "Bill," Hatcher looked down at his boots, "I say you are a good man who is about to lose everything. The bank holds the note on your south pasture, does it not? Father Crow sits on the bank board, and the Cattlemen's Association. They listen to the church. If you keep asking questions about where the tithe money goes, or where the priest buys his supplies, you are going to find yourself with no market for your beef come spring." "Is that a threat?" Jonah asked. "It is a forecast," Hatcher said. "Like seeing a storm coming over the peaks. Drop it. Jonah, for your own sake, let the sheriff handle the missing girl. The sheriff is not handling it," Jonah said. "He is waiting for the snow to bury it." Hatcher sighed and pushed off the stall door. "I warned you. Jonah." A man can only stand against the wind for so long before he breaks. The pressure did not stop at warnings. By noon, the war had moved to Eliza. She had gone into town to trade for flour and sugar. When she entered the mercantile, the conversation died instantly. Thomas Miller, the owner whose daughter was still missing, stood behind the counter. His face was a mask of grief, twisted into hate. "Get out," Miller said. "Mr. Miller, please," Eliza said, keeping her voice steady. "I only need flour. We do not trade with your kind," Miller said, his voice shaking. "Not anymore. Father Crow says you are a blight. He says Sarah might still be here if we had driven you out years ago." Eliza looked around the store. She saw women she had helped through labor, women whose fevered brows she had cooled. They looked away, studying the floor or the shelves, their courage stripped away by the priest's decree. Eliza placed her basket on the floor. She did not storm out. She walked out with her head high, but the dignity cost her everything she had left. As she walked back toward her cabin, the schoolhouse let out for the midday break. A group of boys, emboldened by the talk at their dinner tables, followed her. "Witch!" one shouted. "Where is the baby? Witch!" A stone flew through the air, striking Eliza in the shoulder. She stumbled but kept walking. Another stone hit her arm, then a piece of jagged shale struck her cheek, cutting the skin. She spun around, her eyes flashing. The boys scattered, laughing, running back toward the safety of the town that sanctioned their cruelty. Eliza reached her cabin, her hand pressed to her bleeding cheek. She barred the door and slid down to the floor, the dry sobs finally tearing out of her throat. Jonah found her there an hour later. He saw the cut on her cheek, the bruise forming on her arm. He did not say a word. He walked out, hitched his team to her buckboard wagon, and began loading her things. "What are you doing?" she asked, standing in the doorway. "You are not staying here," Jonah said. "I will not run." She repeated her refrain. "You are not running," Jonah said, hoisting a heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing. "You are coming to work. I have 3 hands with winter cough and a cook with a bad back. I am hiring you as the ranch healer. You will stay in the bunkhouse by the North Creek. It will ruin you," Eliza said, taking me in. Jonah stopped. He looked at her, his eyes soft in a way the town never saw. "They have already taken my credit and my good name. Eliza, they cannot take my land without a fight, and they cannot take my conscience. Get in the wagon." The drive to the remote bunkhouse was silent, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with a shared resolve. The bunkhouse was a sturdy log structure, built for line riders in the deep winter. It had a large stone hearth, a separate room for sleeping, and a solid door that barred from the inside. For the next week, the world narrowed down to the ranch. Jonah moved some of his own gear into the main room of the bunkhouse, ostensibly to guard the perimeter. But in truth, he could not bear to be away from her. The domesticity that sprang up between them was startling in its ease. They fell into a rhythm that felt like it had existed for years. In the mornings, Eliza would brew strong coffee and tend to the poultices for the ranch hands, who treated her with a shy, awkward respect that was a balm to her spirit. In the evenings, Jonah would return from the range, cold and wind-burned, and the smell of stew would greet him at the door. They shared meals at the small pine table, the lantern light casting a warm glow over the rough wood. They talked of safe things at first, the cattle, the weather, the history of the land. But slowly, the conversations deepened. Jonah spoke of Martha, not with the raw pain of fresh grief, but with the melancholy of a memory. He told Eliza how Martha had loved the wildflowers in the spring, how she had hummed while she baked. "She would have liked you," Jonah said one night, staring into his coffee cup. She hated pretense. She liked things that were true. Eliza looked at him across the table. "I never had that," she said softly. "A person to witness my life. I have always been a ghost in other people's stories. The witch, the healer, the half-breed. You are not a ghost to me," Jonah said. "You are the most real thing in this valley." The air in the room shifted. The attraction that had sparked in the blizzard was now a steady, burning flame. It lived in the way Jonah's hand lingered on the door frame when he said good night. It lived in the way Eliza held her breath when he walked past her to stoke the fire. One evening, a fierce windstorm battered the cabin. rattling the shutters. Jonah was mending a bridle by the fire. Eliza was sewing a tear in his coat. Jonah looked up and caught her watching him. The thread was still in her hand. "Eliza," he said. She put the sewing down. Jonah stood up and crossed the small space between them. The tension was a pulled wire, humming with electricity. He reached out and touched the healing cut on her cheek, his thumb brushing the skin with infinite tenderness. "They hurt you because they are afraid," he whispered. "I am not afraid when I am with you," she answered, her voice trembling. He kissed her then, and it was different from the desperate kiss in the line shack. This was slow. It was a question and an answer. His arms went around her, pulling her against the solid wall of his chest. Eliza's hands tangled in the hair at the nape of his neck. The kiss deepened, becoming a hunger that threatened to consume them both. Jonah lifted her, setting her on the edge of the table, his body pressing between her knees. The world outside, the priest, the danger, the judgment, fell away. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged. "I want to be with you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not as a protector, as a man. Eliza looked into his eyes, seeing the raw vulnerability there. She knew what this meant. In the eyes of the church, in the eyes of the town. This was a sin, but in the quiet truth of this room, it felt like the only holy thing left. "Stay," she whispered. They moved to the narrow bed in the back room. There was no hurried fumbling, no frantic grasping. It was a slow, deliberate unveiling. Jonah treated her body with a reverence that made her weep, touching her scars, the physical ones and the invisible ones, with hands that worshipped rather than possessed. For Eliza, it was a reclaiming of her own skin. For Jonah, it was a return to life after years of being buried in snow. They lay together afterwards, limbs tangled under the heavy quilts, the fire dying down in the other room. It was not just passion. It was a profound, anchoring comfort. Two wounded people who had found a way to fit their broken pieces together. "I will not let them take this," Jonah whispered into the darkness, his arm tightening around her. "They cannot take what they do not understand," Eliza answered, resting her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. But the morning brought the cold light of reality. Jonah woke with a clarity he had not felt in years. He looked at Eliza sleeping beside him, her dark hair spread over the pillow, and he knew he could not hide her here forever. The priest was not going to stop. The town was not going to forget. He rose quietly, dressed, and made coffee. When Eliza woke, he was checking the cylinder of his Colt revolver. "Jonah," she said, sitting up, pulling the quilt around her. "We end this today," he said. "We have the receipts. We have the motive, but we need the bodies. We need to show them what he is hiding." Eliza dressed quickly. The tenderness of the night before was folded away, stored in a safe place in their hearts, replaced by the steel of resolve. They rode out before the sun was fully up, taking the back trails toward the church. They did not go to the town. They circled wide, coming up behind the church grounds, tying their horses in a dense thicket of scrub oak. The storage building sat against the hill, gray and imposing. It was a windowless structure of stone and mortar, the roof heavy with slate. Jonah and Eliza approached it from the blind side. The wagon ruts Jonah had seen earlier were still there, frozen into the mud. "This is where the supplies go," Jonah said, "but the building is too small for the amount of lime and chain on those receipts." He walked around the perimeter. The ground sloped sharply downward at the back of the building. He knelt, brushing away a layer of dead leaves and pine needles. "Here," he said. There was a discrepancy in the foundation. The stones were not mortared at the base. It was a false skirting. Jonah jammed his pry bar into the gap and heaved. A section of the wooden skirting, camouflaged with glued stones, groaned and swung outward on hidden hinges. Behind it was a dark, low tunnel, shored up with timber, leading directly under the building. "A cellar," Eliza whispered. "A hidden cellar." Jonah lit the lantern he had brought. "Stay behind me." They crawled into the tunnel. It was damp and smelled of earth and something else, something sweet and rot-sick that made Jonah's stomach turn. The tunnel opened up into a larger subterranean chamber, the original root cellar of an older structure the church had been built over. Jonah stood up, raising the lantern. The light swung in an arc, pushing back the shadows. The room was lined with shelves, but they did not hold potatoes or wine. They held rows of brown bottles, sedatives, coils of rope, and in the center of the room, bolted to the stone floor, were iron rings. Chains lay in heaps like sleeping snakes, but it was the far wall that made the air leave Jonah's lungs. There was a heavy wooden door, barred from the outside. A small, barred window was cut into the wood at eye level. Jonah stepped forward. He could hear a low sound coming from behind the door, a whimpering. He lifted the heavy oak bar, his muscles straining. He pulled the door open. The smell hit him first, the stench of unwashed bodies, waste and fear. He raised the lantern higher, stepping into the cell. The rancher checked inside and froze. Huddled in the corner, on a pile of filthy straw, were three figures. They were emaciated, their eyes wide and white in the sudden light. One was little Mary Sutcliffe, another was Sarah Miller, and the third was a woman Jonah recognized, a drifter who had disappeared 2 years ago, presumed to have moved on. They were alive, but barely. But beyond them, in the shadows of the recess, was a mound of fresh earth, and protruding from the dirt was the distinctive red wool of a shawl and the pale curve of a hand that would never move again. Jonah stood rooted to the spot. The scale of it crashed into him. This was not just a priest hiding a sin. This was a slaughterhouse. For years, Father Crow had been taking the vulnerable, the unwanted, the ones no one would fight for, and using them, discarding them, burying them beneath the very floor where he preached salvation. Eliza let out a strangled cry and rushed forward, falling to her knees beside Mary Sutcliffe. The girl flinched, then recognized Eliza and collapsed into her arms, sobbing. Jonah did not move for another second. He stared at the mound of earth. He felt a cold rage settle over him, colder than the blizzard, harder than the granite of the mountains. He turned to Eliza. "Get them up," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "We are taking them out, and then I am going to bring the whole world to see this." He looked at the receipts in his pocket, then back at the horror in the room. The devil was real, just as the priest had said, but he was not in the wilderness. He was the man holding the keys, and Jonah Hale was about to break the door down. The lantern light flickered against the damp stone walls of the cellar, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to dance with the horror of what lay before them. Jonah Hale stood in the center of the subterranean room, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the three huddled figures in the corner. The smell of rot and despair was a physical weight, pressing against his lungs. "We have to take them," Eliza whispered, her voice cracking as she knelt beside little Mary Sutcliffe. "We cannot leave them in this dark." Jonah looked at the girls. They were frail, their skin translucent and fever-hot. Mary could barely lift her head. The drifter woman was unconscious. To move them now, in the bitter cold of the night, without a wagon and without protection, would be a death sentence. And if they were caught on the road by Hatcher or the priest's men, the narrative would be simple. Jonah Hale had kidnapped these women and was dragging them to the wilderness. They would be shot down before they could speak a word of truth. "We cannot," Jonah said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Eliza spun on him, her eyes fierce. "You would leave them?" "I would save them," Jonah said, gripping her shoulders. "Look at them. Eliza, they cannot ride. If we carry them out now, we are slow. Crow's men will catch us in 5 miles. They will kill us and bury these girls right back in this hole, and no one will ever know." Eliza looked back at the victims, her face agonizingly torn. She knew he was right. The logic was sound, but the heart rebelled against it. "We need a hammer," Jonah said, his voice dropping to a low, steel-hard register. "We need a weapon that Matthias Crow cannot pray away. We need the law, not the sheriff. He is bought. We need a judge." He moved to a small, rough-hewn table near the heavy door. where a ledger and a stack of supplies sat. He rifled through the items, his hand steady despite the rage burning in his gut. "Here," he said. He held up a small object. It was a wooden doll, carved from pine, no bigger than a man's thumb. It had a blue ribbon tied around its neck. "That belongs to Sarah," Eliza said, recognizing it immediately. "Thomas Miller carved it for her last Christmas. She never went anywhere without it." "And this," Jonah said. He picked up a discarded scrap of parchment from the floor. It was a draft of a supply order, crumpled and stained with lamp oil. But at the bottom, pressed into a blob of red wax, was the clear, undeniable impression of the signet ring Father Crow wore on his right hand, a ring bearing the crest of a pelican feeding its young. It was the seal of the church, authorizing the purchase of the very chains that lay in the corner. "We take these," Jonah said. "We ride for the county seat. We find Judge Blackwood. He is riding the circuit and is due in Granite Peak in 2 days. He is a hard man, but he hates corruption more than he hates sin." He turned to the girls. He took off his heavy coat and draped it over Mary and Sarah. "We are coming back," he told them, though their eyes were glazed and unseeing. "Hold on. We are coming back with the storm." Jonah and Eliza retreated from the cellar, their hearts heavy with the guilt of leaving, sealing the hidden door behind them. They masked the entrance with the loose timber and dead leaves, working in a frantic silence. When they emerged into the cold night air, the wind felt clean, but it could not scrub the scent of the prison from their minds. They rode back to the bunkhouse in silence, the weight of the evidence burning a hole in Jonah's pocket. But the devil, as Father Crow was fond of saying, was always awake. The next morning, the atmosphere in Mercy Ridge had shifted from suspicion to open hostility. Jonah rode into town alone, intending to gather supplies for the journey to Granite Peak. He sensed the change the moment his horse's hooves touched the main street. The silence was absolute. No one tipped a hat. No one met his eye. He tied his horse at the rail and walked toward the mercantile. The door was locked. The sign turned to closed. Though it was 10 in the morning, he turned and saw a crowd gathering near the church steps. Father Crow stood at the top, his black cassock whipping in the wind. He looked like a crow perched on a tombstone. "Behold the man!" Crow's voice boomed, carrying easily over the frightened assembly. Jonah stopped in the middle of the street. He did not run. He planted his boots in the mud and faced the priest. "You speak of darkness," Crow shouted, pointing a long, accusing finger at Jonah. "But you invite it into your bed. I have had a vision. My children, a vision of the heathen woman calling down spirits to cloud the mind of our good brother Jonah. She has bewitched him. She has twisted his soul until he can no longer see the light of God." "You are a liar," Jonah called out, his voice calm but carrying a power that made the crowd shift uneasily. Crow smiled, a thin, terrible expression. "Am I? Did you not take her to your line shack? Did you not lay with her while the town mourned? And now, you conspire against the church. You whisper lies about holy charity." The priest stepped down one stair, looming over the town. "I declare this man excommunicate." Crow roared. "Let no man trade with him. Let no man break bread with him. Let his cattle wander and his land go fallow. He is marked by sin. And as for the woman, she is a vessel of the adversary. She must be seized. For the safety of our souls, she must be purified." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Men who Jonah had helped brand cattle, men he had loaned money to in lean years, looked at him with hard, stranger's eyes. Excommunication in the territory was not just a spiritual sentence. It was a social death. It meant no bank would lend to him, no merchant would buy his beef, and no neighbor would help if his barn burned down. Jonah turned to leave, his hand resting near his gun belt. As he walked back to his horse, a woman stepped out from the shadows of the boardwalk. It was Mrs. Etta Gable, the formidable matron of the Double Bar Ranch. She was 60 years old, with skin like leather and eyes that missed nothing. She pretended to adjust her shawl as Jonah passed. "Ride carefully." "Jonah," she murmured, barely moving her lips. "Hatcher is gathering a posse. They are going for the girl now." Behind her, Samuel Paris, the schoolteacher, nodded once, a quick, terrified gesture of solidarity. Jonah did not stop. He mounted his horse and spurted into a gallop, tearing out of town not toward his ranch, but toward the remote bunkhouse where he had left Eliza. He was too late to be early, but he was just in time to be dangerous. As he crested the ridge overlooking the North Creek, he saw them. 5 riders, led by Sheriff Hatcher, were closing in on the bunkhouse. They were moving fast, rifles drawn. Jonah did not hesitate. He pulled his Winchester from the scabbard and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed off the canyon walls. The posse scattered, their horses spooked. Jonah charged down the slope, placing himself between the men and the cabin door. "Back off!" Jonah shouted, levering another round into the chamber. "Jonah, put it down!" Hatcher yelled, reining in his skittish mount. "We have a warrant for her arrest. Witchcraft and kidnapping." "Kidnapping?" Jonah laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "You are looking for kidnappers in the wrong house. Bill." The door of the bunkhouse opened and Eliza stepped out. She held a shotgun, her face pale but composed. "I am not going with you," she said clearly. "Take her," one of the deputies shouted. Raising his pistol, Jonah fired. He did not aim to kill. He aimed at the ground in front of the deputy's horse. The dirt exploded, and the horse reared, throwing the man into the mud. "Ride, Eliza!" Jonah screamed. Eliza dropped the shotgun and vaulted onto the bare back of the horse she had kept saddled near the door. She spun the animal and galloped toward the tree line, toward the mouth of Coyote Canyon. Jonah fired 2 more shots to keep the heads of the posse down, then wheeled his horse and followed her. "Get them!" Hatcher roared behind them. "Shoot the horse if you have to." The chase was on. They did not take the road. The road was death. They took the game trails that wound up into the jagged foothills, into the country that broke wagons and spirits. The landscape became an active enemy. The ground turned from mud to slate and granite. The wind howled through the narrow passes, carrying needles of ice. Jonah pushed his horse hard, catching up to Eliza as they reached the first river crossing. The water was gray and churning, swollen with the early melt and the recent storms. "Cross here!" Jonah shouted over the roar of the water. "It is the only way to the pass." They drove their horses into the freezing current. The water rose to the stirrups, numbing Jonah's legs instantly. His horse stumbled on a slick rock, nearly going down, but Jonah kept the animal's head up with a desperate strength. Eliza, lighter and riding with the fluid grace of her Shoshone ancestors, made the far bank first. She turned, her hair whipping across her face, watching Jonah fight the current. He lunged up the bank, water streaming from his flanks. "Don't stop!" he gasped. "Higher!" They climbed for 3 hours, forcing the horses up switchbacks that were little more than goat paths. The air grew thin, burning in their lungs. Behind them, far below, they could see the specks of the posse giving up at the river line. Hatcher was a paid man, not a desperate one. He would not risk his neck on the scree slopes for a priest's coin. As dusk fell, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson and violet, they reached a small, sheltered depression near the timberline. It was a place of high solitude, surrounded by towering pines and ancient rock. "We are safe for tonight," Jonah said, sliding from his saddle. His legs buckled, the adrenaline crashing out of his system. Eliza was there instantly, catching him. She helped him to a dry patch of ground beneath a rock overhang. They huddled together as the temperature plummeted. They dared not light a large fire, only a small, smokeless flame in a hollow of stones to boil snow for water. They sat in the darkness, the silence of the mountains pressing in around them. They were outlaws now. The life Jonah had built, the ranch, the respect, the quiet routine, was gone. Eliza stared into the tiny flame, her face unreadable. "I am sorry," she said softly. Jonah looked at her. "For what? For dragging you into the fire. You had a good life. Jonah, you were safe. Now you are hunted because of me." Jonah reached out and took her hand. His fingers were rough, wrapped in bandages where the cold had cracked the skin. I was not safe. Eliza, I was asleep. There is a difference. Eliza shook her head. She pulled her hand away and wrapped her arms around her knees. You do not understand, she said. It is not just about the girls. It is about the land. It is always about the land. She looked up at him, and, for the first time, Jonah saw the deep, festering wound that she carried beneath her stoicism. My mother did not just die of sickness. Jonah, she owned the deed to the valley where the church stands now. It was left to her by my father. It was good bottomland. When the town started to grow, they wanted it. Crow wanted it. She paused, her voice trembling. They accused her of immorality. They said a woman of her blood could not hold a Christian deed. They levied fines she could not pay. They shunned her until she could not buy food. She died of a broken heart and a starving body. Jonah, and when she was cold, Crow produced a paper with her mark on it. A mark she never made, giving the land to the church for absolution. Eliza wiped a tear from her cheek with a fierce, angry motion. He took everything from her. Her home, her name. And now he is doing it to you. I am the poison. Jonah, anyone who loves me loses everything. Jonah listened, and the guilt hit him like a physical blow. He had tithed to that church. He had shaken Crow's hand. He had let the man bless his wife's grave. He had been part of the machinery that crushed Eliza's mother, simply by doing nothing. No, Jonah said, his voice thick with emotion. He moved closer to her. You are not the poison. You are the cure. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. I was afraid. Eliza, after Martha died, I was afraid to feel anything because I didn't want to lose it again. I thought protecting my land was the same as protecting my life. But I was wrong. A man who holds on to dirt while his neighbors bleed is not a man. He is just a grave marker. He leaned his forehead against hers. I do not care about the ranch. I do not care about the town. I care that you are breathing. I care that we stop him. We are together in this. If we burn together. But we are not going to burn. We are going to light a fire that cleans this whole valley out. Eliza looked at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. She found none. She found only the steady, unyielding strength of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. The fear of the chase, the cold of the river, and the proximity of death stripped away the last of their defenses. The need to affirm life, to feel warmth and pulse and breath, became overwhelming. Eliza surged forward, kissing him with a fierce intensity. It was a kiss of survival, a claiming. Jonah met her, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her into the shelter of his body. They lay together on the hard ground, wrapped in the buffalo robes and each other. It was not a night for gentle romance. It was a night of desperate clinging. They touched with the reverence of people who know they might not see another sunrise. Every brush of skin, every shared breath was a defiance of the darkness hunting them. In the high, thin air of the mountains, with the wind screaming outside their small shelter, they found a home in each other. It was a rugged, dangerous love, stripped of all pretense, forged in the crucible of injustice. When the sun rose, painting the peaks in gold, Jonah was already awake. He watched the light touch Eliza's sleeping face. He felt a fierce protectiveness that made his hands shake. He woke her with a touch on the shoulder. Eliza, it is time. She opened her eyes, instantly alert. Where are we going? She asked, sitting up and shaking the pine needles from her blanket. Granite Peak, Jonah said, standing up and looking south. Judge Blackwood is there. We have the doll, we have the seal, and now we have the story of your mother. He offered her a hand. We are going to ride into that town, find the judge, and bring the law down on Mercy Ridge like a hammer. Eliza took his hand and stood up. She looked at the horizon, her jaw set. Let's go, she said. They mounted their tired horses and turned south, away from the safety of the high peaks and back toward the world of men. They were ragged, exhausted, and hunted. But as they rode side by side, their shadows stretching long across the rock, they looked less like fugitives and more like an approaching storm. The road south to Granite Peak was not a road at all, but a scar of hard-packed earth twisting through the scrub oak and gray shale. Jonah Hale and Eliza Gray rode with the desperation of people who could feel the breath of the pursuer on their necks. The wind had stripped the clouds from the sky, leaving a dome of relentless, blinding blue that offered no shelter. They had been riding for 10 hours. The horses were blown, their coats slick with sweat that frothed and froze in the biting air. Jonah looked over at Eliza. She rode with her back straight, but he could see the fatigue etched into the corners of her eyes and the pale set of her mouth. She had not complained once. Not when the river water soaked her boots, not when the cold gnawed at her fingers, not when the hunger cramped her stomach. "We need to rest the horses," Jonah said, pulling Rusty to a slow trot. "If we ride them into the ground, we are walking to the judge, and Hatcher will catch a walker." Eliza nodded, pulling her mare up beside him. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon. "There is smoke," she said, pointing toward a stand of cottonwoods near the dry wash of the Purgatory Creek. 2 miles. It might be a posse," Jonah warned, his hand drifting to the Winchester in his saddle scabbard. "It is too small for a posse," Eliza said. "And the smoke is white. Greenwood. A posse burns dry timber for speed. That is a campfire." They approached cautiously. As they broke through the tree line, they found a scene that arrested them both. It was a makeshift settlement, a ragged collection of canvas tents and lean-tos huddled against the wind. But it was not a bandit camp. It was a camp of the displaced. There were families here, a group of Shoshone, their faces weathered and weary, sat near a fire, mending nets and tools. Nearby, a cluster of Chinese railroad workers, cast off after the track was laid, shared a pot of rice. Further back, a few Irish families, dust-covered and hollow-eyed, tended to a broken wagon. These were the people the territory had chewed up and spat out, the people who did not fit into the neat, square lines of the town maps or the church pews. As Jonah and Eliza rode in, a hush fell over the camp. A tall Shoshone man stood up, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He looked at Eliza, noting the beadwork on her moccasins and the set of her face. He spoke in the Shoshone tongue, a question that sounded like the rustle of dry leaves. Eliza answered him in the same language, her voice soft and respectful. She gestured to Jonah, then to the south. The man lowered his rifle. He nodded to a woman near the fire, who began to ladle stew into tin cups. "They are safe," Eliza told Jonah. "They are like us, running from something." They dismounted and accepted the food with gratitude. It was a thin broth of rabbit and sage, but to Jonah, it tasted like salvation. As they ate, the stories began to spill out. The Shoshone man, whose name was Runs with Wind, spoke of a treaty broken by a priest who claimed their winter hunting grounds were consecrated soil, only to sell the timber rights to a mining company a month later. An Irish laborer named Sean told of being hired to build a stone barn, the very storage building behind the church, and then being run off at gunpoint without pay when he asked why there were shackles bolted to the floor. "He told us it was for penance," Sean said, his voice thick with bitterness. "Said the church had to restrain the demons in men, but I never saw a demon that needed a padlock that size." Jonah listened, his jaw tightening. The web of Father Crow's corruption was wider than he had imagined. It was not just missing girls. It was a systematic exploitation of anyone who had no voice to complain. "Will you say that to a judge?" Jonah asked Sean. "If I bring the law to Mercy Ridge, will you stand up and say what you saw?" Sean looked at his wife, who was nursing a thin baby by the fire. He looked at his worn boots. "The priest has men," Sean said. "Hard men. He has bullies," Jonah said firmly. "And bullies break when the light shines on them. I am going to shine the light, but I need you to tell him what you saw in that dark—" Sean was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "For the pay he owes me," Sean said, "and for the fear he put in my Mary's eyes, I will speak." Eliza spent the hour tending to a child with a festering cut on his leg, using the last of her salve. When she was done, Runs with Wind placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have the spirit of the old healers," he said in English, his voice gravelly. The black robe. The priest. He calls it evil. But healing is never evil. Only the wound is evil. They left the camp with fresh supplies and a promise. The migrant workers and the Shoshone families would break camp and move toward Mercy Ridge. They would not arrive in time for the confrontation, but their presence on the road would be a signal that the fear was breaking. Jonah and Eliza pushed on. They did not ride to Granite Peak. They had learned from a rider on the road that Judge Blackwood had already departed the county seat and was en route to Mercy Ridge for the quarterly circuit. "We have to beat him there," Jonah said, spurring his horse. "We have to control the ground before he steps off his carriage." They rode through the night, the moon guiding them over the treacherous passes. By the time they reached the outskirts of Mercy Ridge, it was deep night, the hour before the dawn when the world feels most dead. They did not ride into town. They tethered the horses in the dense scrub oak of the foothills and crept forward on foot. From the ridge, Jonah looked down at his ranch, his heart hammered against his ribs. Torches were moving near his barn. He could hear the lowing of cattle. Panicked and driven, men were pushing his herd, his livelihood, out of the south pasture, and to the west, near the river. A bright orange glow pulsed against the darkness. Eliza's cabin. Eliza stood beside him, watching the flames consume the home she had built with her own hands. She did not cry. She watched with a terrifying stillness. "Let it burn," she whispered. It was just wood. Jonah turned to her, gripping her arm. "He is trying to provoke us," he said. "He wants us to come charging down there so his deputies can shoot us for trespassing. We need the witness," Eliza said, turning her back on the fire. "We need Silas Vane. Silas Vane, the church clerk, lived in a small room at the back of the livery stable." He was a timid man, a man who had spent his life nodding at powerful men in hopes that they would not hit him. But Jonah knew that fear could make a man brave if he was more afraid of the rope than the priest. Jonah moved like a shadow through the back alleys of the town. The main street was empty, but there were lights in the saloon and the sheriff's office. Hatcher was likely planning his next move. Jonah slipped into the livery stable. The smell of hay and horse manure was familiar and grounding. He found the door to the tack room where Silas slept and pressed his ear against it. He heard the sound of weeping. He tried the latch. Locked. Jonah did not knock. He drove his shoulder into the wood, shattering the flimsy lock. Silas Vane shrieked and scrambled back into the corner of his cot, clutching a crucifix. "Don't kill me," Silas sobbed. "I did what he said. I ordered the lie." Jonah crossed the room in 2 strides and clamped a hand over Silas's mouth. "Quiet," Jonah hissed. "I am not here to kill you, Silas. I am here to save your neck." He pulled the trembling man to his feet. "The judge is coming tomorrow, Silas. When he sees those bodies in the cellar, and he will see them, who do you think Father Crow is going to blame? Do you think he will take the rope? Or do you think he will say his poor, confused clerk acted alone?" Silas's eyes went wide. He shook his head violently against Jonah's hand. "He signed the orders," Jonah whispered, removing his hand. "But you placed them. You are the link, Silas, unless you talk, unless you tell the judge exactly how the charity money was spent." Silas slumped, the fight draining out of him. "He will kill me," Silas whispered. "He is in jail, or he is hanging," Jonah said. "But if you stay here, you are dead either way. Come with me." They moved Silas to the outskirts of town, hiding him in the ruins of an old homestead chimney near the meeting point with Eliza. "Now we wait," Jonah said, checking the load in his Winchester. The sun rose over Mercy Ridge like a judgment. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. At 10 in the morning, the dust of a carriage was spotted on the north road. The town bell began to ring. Judge Blackwood was arriving. The townspeople gathered in the square. They were anxious, their faces drawn. They knew something was coming. The smoke from Eliza's cabin still drifted on the breeze, a pungent reminder of the violence in their midst. Father Crow stood on the steps of the church. He was dressed in his finest vestments, a picture of holy authority. Sheriff Hatcher and 4 heavily armed deputies stood at the base of the stairs, a wall of steel between the priest and the world. The judge's carriage rolled into the square. Judge Theophilus Blackwood stepped out. He was a small man, Sharp-featured, dressed in a severe black suit. He carried a cane, not for walking, but for punctuation. Father Crow descended the stairs, his arms spread in welcome. "Judge Blackwood!" Crow boomed. "Welcome to Mercy Ridge, though I fear you find us in a time of spiritual siege." Blackwood looked at the priest, then at the armed deputies. "I see the siege." "Father," Blackwood said, his voice dry as dust, "but I usually find that spiritual battles require fewer Winchesters. We are hunting a wolf." "Judge," Crow said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sorrow, "a man of our own flock, led astray by a heathen witch. They have kidnapped children. They have fled into the wilderness." "Is that so?" a voice rang out. The crowd parted. Jonah Hale walked into the square. He walked with a limp, but his head was high. He held his rifle in one hand, barrel pointed at the ground, and in the other, he held the thick leather ledger. Eliza walked beside him. She wore her buckskin tunic, stained with the mud of the river and the soot of the campfire. She looked neither humble nor defiant. She looked inevitable. Behind them, stumbling and pale, came Silas Vane. Hatcher's hand went to his gun. "Stop right there! Hale!" Hatcher shouted. "You're under arrest." "I'm here to see the judge," Jonah said, not breaking stride. "Unless you plan to shoot a man in front of the circuit court." "Bill." Hatcher hesitated. He looked at the judge, who was watching the scene with hawk-like intensity. "Let him speak, Sheriff," Blackwood said. Jonah stopped 10 paces from the priest. He threw the ledger onto the dusty ground at the judge's feet. It landed with a heavy thud. "That is the church record," Jonah said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "It shows 10 years of theft. It shows money meant for orphans buying quicklime and chains." "Lies," Crow shouted, his face reddening. "Forgeries by the devil's whore." Jonah reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden doll. He held it up. "Thomas Miller." Jonah called out to the crowd. "Thomas, look at this." Thomas Miller pushed through the crowd. He stared at the small pine carving. He let out a choked sound. "That is Sarah's," Miller whispered. "We found it in the cellar beneath the church storage house," Jonah said, "along with your daughter, and Mary Sutcliffe, and the woman who disappeared 2 years ago." A gasp went through the crowd. "They are alive," Jonah said. "Barely, but they are there." Behind a door locked with Father Crow's own seal. Crow's composure cracked. He pointed a trembling finger at Eliza. "She put them there. She is a witch. She uses the blood of innocents to brew her potions. She is trying to frame the Holy Church because we drove her darkness out." Eliza stepped forward. She did not shout. She spoke with a calm, devastating clarity that cut through the priest's hysteria. "There is no darkness in me that you did not put there," Eliza said. "You speak of the devil, Matthias, but the devil does not live in the woods. He does not live in the herbs I use to heal your children. The devil is a man who thinks he is God." She looked at the townspeople, meeting their eyes one by one. "You let him do it," she said. "You threw stones at my cabin because it was easier than asking where your money went. You called me a monster, so you did not have to look at the monster standing in the pulpit. You let him wear a mask of holiness while he buried your daughters under the floorboards." The truth of her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Judge Blackwood stepped forward. He used the tip of his cane to flip open the ledger. He looked at the receipts pasted there. He looked at Silas Vane. "Mr. Vane," the judge said, "do you recognize this book?" Silas sobbed, falling to his knees. "It is true, all of it. The chains, the lime. He told me they were possessed. He told me he had to beat the sin out of them. I heard them screaming. The square erupted." Thomas Miller let out a roar of rage and lunged toward the deputies. "Arrest them!" Crow shrieked. "Kill them all! They are possessed!" Hatcher drew his gun, leveling it at Jonah. "Drop it! Jonah!" But before Hatcher could fire, a shot rang out. But it did not come from Jonah. It came from the porch of the general store. Mrs. Etta Gable stood there, a shotgun pressed against her shoulder. Smoke curled from the barrel. She had fired into the air. "Put the gun down." "Bill, Mrs.," Gable said. her voice hard as iron. Around the square, other men began to step forward. Ranch hands, shopkeepers, men who had been afraid for too long. They moved to stand between Jonah and the deputies. They drew their own weapons. The sheriff looked at the crowd. He looked at Mrs. Gable. He looked at the judge. He realized the wind had changed. He slowly lowered his pistol and placed it on the ground. Crow stood alone on the steps. His allies had evaporated. The mask had slipped completely now, revealing a terrified, vicious old man. "You cannot touch me!" Crow screamed. "I am the voice of God!" Jonah walked up the steps. He holstered his rifle. He stopped inches from the priest. "You are just a man," Jonah said softly. "And you are done." Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the tension. "Sheriff Hatcher, you are relieved of duty." "Deputy, place Matthias Crow under arrest for kidnapping, embezzlement, and murder. And someone get down to that cellar and get those girls out." The spell broke. The crowd surged forward, not to kill, but to witness. 2 deputies grabbed Crow, who was spitting and cursing, dragging him down the stairs. Jonah did not watch him go. He turned to Eliza. She was standing in the middle of the chaos, her shoulders finally slumping. The adrenaline that had sustained her for days was gone, leaving only exhaustion. Jonah walked to her and wrapped his arms around her. She buried her face in his chest, and he felt her shake. "It is over," he whispered into her hair. "It is finally over." They stood there in the middle of the dusty square, an island of quiet in the sea of shouting men and weeping families. The sun beat down on them, warm and real. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows over the town, Jonah and Eliza sat on the porch of the ranch house, Jonah's house, which still stood, though his cattle were scattered and his fences cut. The judge had taken statements. The girls had been moved to the hotel, where the doctor was tending to them. The town was in shock, a community waking up from a long, fevered nightmare. Jonah handed Eliza a cup of coffee. She took it, her fingers brushing his. "They will rebuild the cabin," Jonah said. "Thomas Miller said the men will start tomorrow." "I do not know if I want it back," Eliza said, looking out at the darkening plains. "Too many ghosts." Jonah looked at her. He saw the strength in her profile, the beauty that had survived the fire. "Then don't go back," he said. "Stay here." Eliza turned to him. "Here, with the man who was excommunicated?" Jonah smiled, a slow, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. The judge lifted the excommunication, said he did not think the Almighty took orders from felons, but even if he hadn't, "I would rather be an outcast with you than a saint without you." Eliza set the cup down. She moved closer to him on the bench. "It will be hard," she said. "They will never truly forget. I will always be the Shoshone woman. You will always be the man who defied the church." "Good," Jonah said. "Let them remember. It will keep them honest." He put his arm around her, pulling her close. "We have a lot of work to do. Eliza, the herd is scattered. The fences are down." Eliza rested her head on his shoulder. She watched the first stars appear in the vast, western sky. "I am not afraid of work. Jonah Hale." "I know," he said, kissing the top of her head. They sat in the silence, watching the night roll in. It was not a menacing darkness anymore. It was just the night, cool and vast and indifferent. And for the first time in their lives, they did not feel small beneath it. They felt rooted. They felt found. Their love had been born in a blizzard, tested in fire, and forged in the pursuit of a justice that most people gave up on. It was not a pretty love, tied up in ribbons. It was a love like the land itself, rough, enduring, and capable of weathering any storm that came over the mountains. Jonah took a breath of the cool air. "Welcome home, Eliza." She closed her eyes and let out a long, slow breath. "I am home." The gavel struck the block of heartwood with a sound like a pistol shot, echoing through the stifling air of the territorial courthouse. This was not Mercy Ridge. This was Oak Creek, a town large enough to boast a 2-story hotel and a jailhouse built of red brick rather than timber. The room smelled of unwashed wool, stale tobacco, and the sharp, nervous sweat of men who were unaccustomed to sitting still on hard benches. Jonah Ainsley sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded so tightly that his knuckles were the color of bleached bone. Beside him sat his attorney, a man named Samuel Hart, who wore a suit that had seen better years but whose eyes were sharp and devoid of fear. Across the aisle, Father Crow sat with the composed stillness of a statue. He wore his collar like a shield. Even here, stripped of his pulpit, the man commanded a certain deference. The town of Oak Creek did not know him as a monster. They knew him only as a man of God accused by a drifter and a woman of color. The trial had dragged on for 3 days, a slow grinding of wheels that felt less like justice and more like a theatrical performance designed to break the spirit. The defense attorney, a silver-tongued man named Sterling who had come all the way from Denver, had spent the morning dismantling Jonah's character. Mr. Sterling paced before the jury box, hooking his thumbs into his waistcoat. He turned his gaze upon Jonah, a look of pity that felt sharper than hate. "You stated that you found the hidden room by accident, Mr. Sterling said, his voice carried to the back of the room without effort. "You stated that you were looking for evidence because you did not trust the good Father. But tell me, Mr. Ainsley, is it not true that since the passing of your wife, you have suffered from fits of melancholia?" Jonah kept his eyes on the lawyer. "I have grieved. That is not madness." Mr. Sterling nodded slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Grief can do terrible things to a man's mind. It can make him see shadows where there are none. It can make him look for someone to blame for the cruelty of the world. You are a lonely man, living on a failing ranch, surrounded by silence. Is it not possible that your imagination created a villain because you could not bear the quiet?" "I saw what I saw," Jonah said. "The chains were real. The journals were real." "So you say," Sterling countered. "But we have only your word and the word of a woman who, let us be frank, has her own reasons for despising authority. You are a man seduced by your own sorrow. Mr. Ainsley, you wanted a dragon to slay, so you painted scales on a priest." The murmurs from the gallery were low but distinct. Jonah felt the heat rise in his neck. They were painting him as a broken thing, a man whose mind had snapped under the weight of the frontier. It was a simpler story for the jury to believe than the truth. The truth required them to accept that evil could wear a holy face. When it was Eliza's turn to take the stand, the atmosphere in the room shifted from skepticism to hostility. She walked to the witness chair with her head high, her dress simple and clean, but the eyes of the crowd dissected her. In Oak Creek, as in Mercy Ridge, a woman like Eliza was tolerated only as long as she remained invisible. By stepping into the light of the court, she had become a target. Sterling did not treat her with the mock pity he had shown Jonah. He treated her with cold, intellectual disdain. "Miss Vance," Sterling began, "you call yourself a healer." "I am a healer," Eliza replied. Her voice was steady, though Jonah could see the slight tremor in her hands where they rested on her lap. Sterling picked up a piece of paper from his table. "I have heard reports that you brew mixtures of roots and herbs, that you chant over the sick. Some might call that medicine. Others, God-fearing folk, might call it something else." "I use the earth," Eliza said. "I use what grows. There is no magic in it, only knowledge." Sterling leaned in against the railing of the witness stand. "You are not of this town. You are not of our faith. You live on the edge of society, mixing potions. And yet we are to believe your word over that of an ordained priest. You claim Father Crow held women against their will. Or is it that you simply hate what he represents?" "I hate cruelty," Eliza said. "I do not care what coat it wears." Sterling turned to the jury, spreading his hands. "A woman who deals in roots and shadows. A woman who has been seen entering Mr. Ainsley's home at all hours. Are we to assume her testimony is born of righteousness? Or is she perhaps protecting the man who has given her shelter?" The implication hung in the air, thick and ugly. He was suggesting that Eliza was not only a witch, but a woman of loose morals, buying Jonah's protection with her favor. The shame of it was meant to silence her, to make her small. Jonah half rose from his seat, his jaw tight. But Samuel Hart placed a heavy hand on his forearm, forcing him down. "If you lose your temper now," Hart whispered, "you lose the case." Eliza did not look at Jonah. She looked directly at Father Crow. The priest met her gaze, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He thought he had won. He thought the walls of prejudice were too high for them to climb. "I know what I saw," Eliza said, her voice cutting through the tension. "And I know what that man took from those girls. You can speak of roots and potions all you like, sir, but that does not change the fact that there are graves behind that church that do not have names." The trial dragged into the afternoon. The exhaustion was a physical weight. Jonah and Eliza sat separately during the recess, too tired to speak, consumed by the fear that justice was a luxury they could not afford. The jury looked bored. The judge looked ready for his dinner. The law of the West was often just the will of the strongest men, and Crow had the strength of the church behind him. Then, just as the sun began to dip low, casting long amber beams through the dust-moted windows, the courtroom doors opened. Samuel Hart stood up. "Your Honor, the defense calls one final witness. We were not sure she would arrive in time, but she is here." A woman walked down the center aisle. She was older, perhaps 50, with a face worn by wind and worry. She wore a bonnet that had been patched multiple times, and her hands were rough with work. The room went silent, not out of respect, but out of curiosity. "State your name for the court." Judge Blackwood said, "Martha Miller." The woman said. Crow's head snapped around. For the first time, the statue cracked. His face drained of color, leaving him looking gray and sudden. "Mrs." Miller took the stand. She did not look at the jury. She looked only at Father Crow, and her eyes were filled with a terrifying sorrow. "Mrs. Miller," Samuel Hart said gently. "You lived in Mercy Ridge 7 years ago, did you not?" "I did," she answered. "My husband and I ran the dry goods store before the fire. And why did you leave?" "Mrs." Miller took a deep breath. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tattered ribbon. It was blue, faded to nearly gray. "We left because our daughter, Sarah, fell ill. She went to the church for comfort. She went to him." She pointed a shaking finger at Crow. "He told us she needed to stay for a spiritual cleansing." "Mrs." Miller continued. "He told us she was possessed by a darkness that only he could pray away. We believed him. He was the priest. We left her there for 3 days. When he finally let her come home, she would not speak. She would not eat. She faded away like snow in the sun." "Objection," Sterling shouted. "This is hearsay. This is irrelevant to the current charges." "It is a pattern," Hart roared back, dropping his calm demeanor. "This establishes a history of coercion and concealment." The judge banged his gavel. "Overruled. The witness will continue." "Mrs." Miller wiped her eyes. "Sarah died 2 months later, but before she passed, she wrote a letter. She was too ashamed to tell us to our faces. We found it after we had already moved 2 towns over, trying to outrun the ghost of her." Hart held out his hand. "Do you have that letter?" "Mrs. Miller." She handed it to him. It was yellowed, brittle parchment. Hart did not read it aloud. He simply handed it to the judge. Judge Blackwood put on his spectacles. The room was so quiet that the sound of the paper rustling was like a shout. The judge read for a long time. His expression did not change, but the color in his face deepened. He looked up, his eyes hard. "Enter this into evidence," the judge said. His voice was flat, dangerous. The testimony of Martha Miller broke the dam. It was not the words of a lonely rancher or a healer woman that swayed the room. It was the voice of a mother who had lost a child. The illusion of Father Crow's sanctity shattered. The jury could no longer hide behind their prejudices. The cruelty was laid bare, stripped of its holy language. The verdict came 2 hours later. Guilty. The word hung in the air. There were no cheers. There was no applause. It was not a triumph. It was a heavy, suffocating acknowledgement of failure. The town of Mercy Ridge, and the law itself, had allowed this man to prey on the vulnerable for years. They had looked away because it was easier. They had doubted Jonah and Eliza because it was convenient. Crow did not scream or repent. As the bailiff moved to shackle him, he stood with a chilling dignity, looking at the jury with contempt. He was led away, the chains rattling, a sound that mirrored the chains Jonah had found in the cellar. The ride back to Mercy Ridge 3 days later was quiet. The euphoria of victory that Jonah had expected never came. Instead, there was a hollowness. The evil was gone, but the scars remained. Mercy Ridge was a town in shock. As Jonah guided the wagon down the main street, heads turned, but eyes were quickly averted. There was shame in the way the shopkeepers swept their porches. There was shame in the way the men at the saloon lowered their voices. They knew now that they had been complicit in their silence. The weeks that followed were hard. The trial had cost Jonah nearly everything he had saved. He had neglected the ranch during the investigation and the weeks in Oak Creek. Fences were down, cattle had strayed, and the winter feed was dangerously low. The bank in town, sensing weakness, sent a letter inquiring about the status of his mortgage. One morning, Jonah stood by the corral, looking at a section of fence that had rotted through. He did not have the money for new timber. He did not have the strength to cut it alone. He leaned his forehead against the rough post, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He heard the sound of a wagon approaching. He stiffened, expecting the banker or a debt collector. Instead, it was Silas, a rancher from the northern valley who had not spoken a kind word to Jonah in 5 years. Beside him was a young man, his son. The wagon was loaded with split rails. Silas pulled the horses to a stop. He did not smile. He did not offer a handshake. He simply nodded at the broken fence. "Looks like you need some wood," Silas said. Jonah stared at him. "I cannot pay you for it." "Silas, not until after the spring drive." Silas spat into the dirt. "I did not ask for payment. I had extra, and my boy needs to learn how to set a post properly." They worked in silence for the better part of the day. It was not an apology. Men like Silas did not know how to apologize with words. But the rhythm of the hammers, the sharing of water from a canteen, the sweat shed on the same soil, that was the language of repair. Over the next month, it happened again. A sack of flour left on the porch, a blacksmith who refused to charge for shoeing Jonah's mare. The town was trying to heal itself, one small, awkward act at a time. Eliza faced her own transformation. She had expected to be driven out, but the public story had changed. She was no longer the witch. She was the woman who had stood against the devil. The town council, a group of 4 men who usually gathered in the back of the general store, came to her cabin. They stood hat in hand, looking uncomfortable among the drying herbs. "Miss Vance," the mayor said, clearing his throat, "we have been discussing the matter of public health, with the doctor in Oak Creek being a day's ride away. We feel Mercy Ridge needs its own facility." Eliza crossed her arms. "And you want me to run it?" "We are prepared to offer the use of the old schoolhouse," the mayor said, "and a small stipend from the town funds. It is not much, but it is a start." It was more than a job offer. It was an admission that she belonged. It was a shift from scapegoat to essential pillar. Eliza accepted, not with gratitude, but with a dignified nod. She would help them, not because they deserved it, but because it was who she was. Jonah and Eliza found themselves sitting on the porch of Jonah's ranch house one evening in late April. The air had turned from the biting cold of winter to the crisp promise of spring. The sagebrush was regaining its color, a dusty silver green stretching out to the horizon. They were both tired. The lines around Jonah's eyes were deeper than they had been a year ago. Eliza's hands were rougher. They sat in rocking chairs, a respectful distance apart, watching the sun bleed orange and purple into the western sky. "It is quiet," Eliza said softly. "It is," Jonah agreed. They did not speak of love in the way the poets did. There were no grand declarations. The West did not allow for such frivolity. Their love was a thing of calluses and shared burdens. It was the knowledge that when the snow was 4 feet deep, the other would be there to help shovel. It was the understanding that they had both looked into the abyss and refused to blink. Jonah reached across the space between them and took her hand. His skin was dry and warm against hers. "I am going to plant corn in the south pasture this year," Jonah said. "I think the soil is ready." Eliza squeezed his hand. "And I will need shelves built in the clinic. The jars are piling up on the floor." "I will build them," Jonah said. It was a promise of a future, a life rooted in work, tenderness, and shared purpose. They had walked through the fire and come out on the other side, not unscathed, but whole. The wind picked up, rushing down from the mountains, smelling of pine and melting snow. It rattled the loose boards of the barn and stirred the dust in the yard. The land was still wild. It was still harsh and indifferent to their struggles. But as the first stars pricked the darkening sky, the light from the ranch house window cast a warm, steady glow against the night. It was a home built on truth rather than fear. It was a place where romantic love had survived tragedy and stood against prejudice with quiet, enduring strength. Thank you so much for listening to the story. I hope you found this conclusion to Jonah and Eliza's journey meaningful. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from. Please leave a comment sharing your location. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. And feel free to share your thoughts on this ending in English. I look forward to reading your insights.